Let's get right into it. Number 9. The Iceberg was the real villain. We've all seen the movies, the documentaries, the dramatic reenactments. You know the drill. A giant, majestic, supposedly unsinkable ship is sailing through the icy North Atlantic, and then bam! A rogue iceberg, a literal mountain of frozen water, decides to play chicken and wins. Our entire cultural understanding of the Titanic disaster is built on this narrative. A huge ship, a huge iceberg, and a tragic meeting of the two. We see the iceberg as the villain, the unstoppable force of nature that no human ingenuity could overcome. It's a clean, simple, and dramatic story. But what if I told you that the iceberg was, in fact, a complete red herring? A conveniently frozen scapegoat for a much more sinister and utterly human problem. For over a century, we've been pointing fingers at the big, beautiful iceberg and telling ourselves the same lie, that a single piece of floating ice was the root cause of this nautical tragedy. In reality, the iceberg was just the last domino to fall in a long line of completely preventable, man-made disasters. It's like blaming a car crash on a wet road instead of the driver who was texting and driving 90 miles an hour. Number 8. The fatal design flaw you've never heard of. You've probably heard that the Titanic was designed with several watertight compartments, and you've likely seen the diagrams showing them filling up like a sink with the plug pulled out. It's a detail everyone knows, a factoid that's become as famous as the ship itself. The problem is, this entire design was built on a critical, yet laughably simple error. Imagine filling up an ice cube tray. Each little compartment is separate, right? You can pour water into one and it won't spill into the next. That was the theory behind the Titanic's design. The engineers believed that even if a few compartments flooded, the ship would still float. But they forgot one tiny little detail: gravity. The watertight compartments were only watertight horizontally. The walls separating them didn't go all the way to the top of the ship. They were like a series of shallow cups, all connected at the top. So, when the bow of the ship began to dip after hitting the iceberg, the water simply spilled over the top of the supposedly watertight bulkheads, cascading from one compartment to the next, like a chain reaction. The ship, which was designed to be unsinkable, had a ridiculously simple design flaw that made its fate inevitable the moment it started to take on water. It wasn't a flaw in the steel, or the rivets, or the captain's judgment. It was a flaw in basic physics. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to anticipate the most obvious consequence of their own design. Number 7. The poor were actually doomed by design. You've probably heard the tragic tale of the third-class passengers, stuck below decks, behind locked gates and twisting corridors, desperately trying to find a way to the upper deck as the ship began to sink. The movie Titanic famously shows this in heartbreaking detail, and it's a story we've all accepted as historical fact. The poor were doomed because they couldn't get out. But this is another one of those beautiful, sad lies we tell ourselves to make sense of a chaotic event. The real reason they were trapped wasn't a conspiracy of locked gates, but a much more mundane and insidious form of class segregation. Third-class passengers were mostly immigrants, and they were legally required to be kept separate from the first- and second-class passengers for public health reasons, a policy known as alien segregation. The logic was that a bunch of new arrivals might be carrying diseases, so they needed to be contained. The design of the ship reflected this. The staircases and corridors weren't just a simple path to the lifeboats. They were a complex maze of twists, turns, and dead ends, specifically designed to funnel people in one direction and keep them away from the other classes. So, while a few gates might have been locked, it wasn't a deliberate act of malice in the moment. Their fate was sealed the moment the ship was designed, not by a last-minute decision, but by the same rigid social order that existed in 1912. The rich got the lifeboats because their decks were a straight shot to safety, and the poor were left to navigate a labyrinth designed to keep them separate, not safe. Number 6. The captain was a hero. In the mythos of the Titanic, Captain Edward Smith is often portrayed as a stoic, brave figure who went down with his ship, a man who gave his life for his passengers. We picture him standing on the bridge, calmly accepting his fate as the waves crash over the bow. It's a powerful image, the kind of ending a real captain is supposed to have. The problem is, Captain Smith wasn't the heroic leader we imagine. For one, he completely ignored multiple ice warnings. Not just one or two, but at least 5 separate warnings from other ships about ice fields in the area. In fact, the warnings were so frequent that one of the ship's wireless operators, Jack Phillips, famously got annoyed and told a nearby ship to shut up because their warning was interrupting a private message he was sending to the mainland. Even after the collision, Captain Smith's leadership was, at best, confusing. He initially ordered the lifeboats to be filled with women and children, but then gave a vague order to fill them with passengers, which led to half-empty lifeboats being launched while hundreds of people were still on board. He was the man in charge, the person responsible for the ship's safety, and he made a series of decisions that, in retrospect, seem bafflingly negligent. He was a product of his time, a man who believed in the invincible nature of the ship he commanded, but that doesn't make him a hero. It makes him a captain who was either shockingly naive or overconfident to the point of hubris, and a man whose pride contributed to a disaster we're still talking about. Number 5. The lifeboats were a gimmick. Okay, here's a fun fact you can pull out at your next dinner party. The Titanic carried more lifeboats than was legally required at the time. This is often cited as proof that the White Star Line wasn't cutting corners and that the tragedy was simply an unavoidable accident. After all, if they had more lifeboats than the law required, how could they be held responsible? But this is a classic example of a truth that's actually a lie. While they did exceed the minimum requirement, which was based on the ship's tonnage, they had nowhere near enough lifeboats for everyone on board. The lifeboats they did have could only hold about half of the passengers and crew. So, while they met the letter of the law, they failed miserably at the spirit of it. But the real kicker is why they had so few lifeboats in the first place. It wasn't just an oversight, it was an intentional design choice. The White Star Line's CEO, Bruce Ismay, believed that having too many lifeboats would clutter the deck and detract from the luxurious, open aesthetic of the ship. He wanted to give his wealthy passengers a pristine, unobstructed view of the ocean. The lifeboats were, in essence, an afterthought, a legal necessity that was visually minimized to maximize profits and luxury. They were a checkbox on a legal document, not a serious plan for a worst-case scenario. And that's a beautiful, dark irony, isn't it? The very thing that was supposed to save them was a visual inconvenience, a minor detail they felt comfortable ignoring. Number 4. The hero of the night was a secret saboteur. You've probably never heard the name J. Bruce Ismay. If you have, it's probably in the context of him being the villain who pressured the captain to go faster and then in a cowardly act fled on a lifeboat. He was the head of the White Star Line, the very company that owned the ship. He was a ruthless businessman, and he was absolutely on board for the maiden voyage. The conventional story paints him as the ultimate coward, a rich man who saved himself while others died. But the real story is so much weirder and more complex than that. The truth is there was another ship, the Californian, that was just a few miles away from the Titanic, completely stopped in an ice field. The wireless operator on the Californian had been trying to warn the Titanic about the ice. But as we already know, the Titanic's operator was too busy sending telegrams for the passengers. He basically told the Californian to get lost. But after the collision, the Californian saw the distress rockets from the Titanic. They saw them, and they debated what they were. But ultimately they decided they were probably just fireworks or some kind of celebratory flare. And here's where Ismay's story gets even more bizarre. He was the one who told a group of passengers on the Titanic to get into a lifeboat, basically ordering them to abandon ship. He was also the one who, in the aftermath, took the lead in the rescue effort, even after he himself had been saved. He wasn't the heroic captain who went down with his ship, but he wasn't the purely selfish villain we imagine either. He was a human being caught in an unthinkable situation, and the narrative we've built around him is a beautiful lie, a way to make sense of a chaotic event by creating a clear villain. Number 3. The myth of the unsinkable ship. The most famous lie of all, the one that's become a punchline for over 100 years, is the idea that the Titanic was unsinkable. This is a myth that's been repeated so often we accept it as fact. The truth? No one, not the engineers, not the owners, not the captain, ever claimed the Titanic was unsinkable. The term was never used in any of the company's official marketing materials. The phrase was an exaggeration, a bit of hyperbole used by journalists to sell newspapers in the early 20th century. When a writer for a magazine called Shipbuilder described the ship as practically unsinkable, they were referring to its watertight compartments, a new technology at the time. It was a technical description, not a marketing slogan. But the press, always looking for a good angle, latched onto it and ran with it, turning a dry technical description into a global myth. And we, the public, have been repeating it ever since. The tragedy of the Titanic wasn't just that it sank. It was that it was a ship that was believed to be so safe, so magnificent, so technologically advanced, that it lulled everyone, the captain, the crew, and the passengers, into a false sense of security. The lie was born from journalism, not from the company itself, and that lie has become the entire foundation of our understanding of the disaster. Number 2, the musician's final performance was a staged story. Everyone knows the story of the Titanic's band. As the ship sank, they played on a final beautiful act of defiance against the inevitable. It's an iconic moment, a tear-jerking scene in every movie, and a symbol of human courage in the face of death. But like so many other aspects of the Titanic legend, this story is also a beautiful lie. The truth is, the story of the band playing on was a myth, a piece of heroic fiction created in the aftermath of the disaster to comfort a grieving world. In reality, the musicians had scattered to find their own lifeboats. Some of them died, and some of them survived. The idea of them playing together as the ship went down was a convenient piece of mythology, a way to add a layer of dignity and grace to an otherwise chaotic and horrifying event. It was a lie that was created and accepted because it made the tragedy more palatable, more beautiful. It made the deaths of over 1,000 people seem less random and more meaningful. It was a lie that served a purpose, a lie that gave us a heroic narrative to cling to in the face of unimaginable horror. Number 1, the unsinkable ship wasn't even that special. Okay, let's get to the biggest lie of all, the one that makes the whole story so much stranger. We've been told for over a century that the Titanic was a marvel of human engineering, a pinnacle of luxury and technology. It was the largest ship ever built, a floating city, a testament to the power of human ingenuity. But here's the cold, hard historical truth. The Titanic wasn't really that special. It was the second of 3 ships in its class. The Olympic had already been built and was already in service. The Titanic was just a slightly bigger, slightly more luxurious version of a ship that already existed. It was a mass-produced product, not a one-of-a-kind engineering masterpiece. The real reason it's so famous is simple. It was the one that sank. We remember the Titanic, and we forget the Olympic, because tragedy is a far more compelling story than success. The story of the Titanic is a story of a ship that was supposed to be a triumph, but became a cautionary tale. It's a story we've told ourselves so many times that we've forgotten the truth. It was just another ship, a footnote in history that became a legend only because it happened to hit an iceberg. And in a way, that's the most tragic part of the whole thing. The Titanic wasn't a symbol of human hubris. It was a symbol of human indifference. We remember it as the ultimate symbol of a lie, and we've been telling ourselves that lie ever since. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.